The 4 blocks between Southwest 3rd and 5th and Morrison and Taylor Streets in the middle of downtown Portland have their own extensive history. A history very much revolving around being a transitional place between 2 very different parts of town. In the early days of Portland, Morrison Street was more to the south end of town, but rapidly the area south of there was developed as the city grew. To the north of this project site was the city's main commercial district, while the area south of there developed more as a residential district. An early transitional site. By the 1880s, this particular area had transitioned to the center of Portland's Tenderloin district, with a brothel functioning out of just about every building. But by the 1890s, the center of the city's brothels had moved north of Morrison Street. While the area had its sex worker elements clearing out, it hardly meant the area blossomed, but rather it transitioned into a fairly unremarkable section of town, with the 1893 Gilbert Building being one of the most attractive structures on site. The area to the immediate south of this site would, itself, become the lesser-known Skid Row of the city, packed with crime, flophouses, saloons, and so on. And this project site remained a transitional place between there and the business district. Starting in the 1950s, the plans for a massive urban renewal project in the southern edge of downtown started to take off. Known as the South Auditorium Urban Renewal Project, much of the structures to the south but near the waterfront were demolished. However, the rough area between Jefferson and Taylor Streets remained. Crime remained in the area, with several rundown hotels there being closed down and/or demolished. As was commonplace all over downtown, many of the structures once standing on these 4 blocks were demolished over the years to make for more parking. And that's how things stood on this site come 1979, and the Cadillac Fairview Corporation, which had come to the city looking to buy and completely revive these 4 blocks. But by the dawn of 1980, months after the project was first announced, things had yet to take off. And if Cadillac Fairview, or CF, was hoping for progress in the immediate future, they were likely taken aback by Portland Mayor Connie McCready's statement on January 4, 1980, at her State of the City speech. This project was not right for Portland. While following the headline alone, one may have figured this was a mayor going to war against a developer. McCready's stance, like those before, was that if the project was ever going to move forward, things needed to change. While she did still express positivity about the project initially. But even then, she did express that she had concerns, and perhaps the survey report produced in December 1979 only exacerbated those concerns. And despite the ongoing narrative that CF and city personnel were always on good terms and the project was always a go, it seemed there wasn't a lot of budging when it came to addressing these key issues of change. And now, to her credit, the mayor was saying, "Finally, fix this stuff, or we're done." Somebody had to say it. But as time went on, even reaching and perhaps passing the tension on the matter of property condemnation, was the issue of historical preservation. And it seemed this issue was the one that first exposed a possible crack in the calm and cool demeanor that the CF had shown to this point. Prior to Mayor McCready's remarks, Martin Seaton, a Cadillac Fairview vice president, came out and flatly said that they couldn't see a way that the buildings of historical significance could be kept on those blocks, without stopping the project. And this came after statements from CF directly that they would work with this issue. In short, there were 3 buildings on these 4 blocks that locals were really fighting for. The 1893 Gilbert Building, aka the Taylor Hotel, the 1907 Corbett Building, and the 1891 Goodenough Building. But even in the case of the Goodenough Building, the city was willing to let the CF build something new there as long as the distinct facade of the building remained. While these 3 were the focus in this case, there were a few other buildings of note on this site as well. While not necessarily historical at the time, at the southwest corner of the site stood the 1964 Chamber of Commerce building. At 4th and Yamhill stood a brick retail building, built in 1918 that historical records suggest may have also had a theater inside at some point. And finally, there was another retail/office-style building that may have been associated with the YMCA, built in 1894. This one was also located near 4th and Yamhill. Now, some may wonder why so much resistance happened in relation to this project over just a couple of old buildings. And there was even a plan in place to possibly relocate the Gilbert Building across 3rd Avenue to where an old store building was located. And why this resistance was so great, even in the face of a project that would have provided a much-needed economic boost to the city, even if it wasn't quite as successful as projections suggested. We must remember that this was the end of the 1970s, the decade that marked an explosion in the city of Portland with regards to preserving what historical structures were still existing in town. So many of them had been demolished over the decades, dating back as far as the late 1920s. And by the late 60s, people started realizing how much beauty had been destroyed in the name of progress, or namely more parking. The city would establish a Historic Landmarks Commission in 1968, and the support for preservation caught fire. And this is where we were when the CF project called for the demolition of 3 historic buildings. And while discussions earlier had been diplomatic in terms of saving as much historical architecture on the site as possible, by this point, at the start of 1980, that position had shifted, with CF questioning if the project could be done with the land they would lose. And Scott Toombs, an executive for Cadillac Fairview, would call the whole thing unworkable and not economically possible. And Mayor McCready, in relation to where the project stood at this time, stated, "From what I have seen of the design they propose for Portland, I can tell you frankly, I don't like that one either. Unless there are significant changes made in the design of this project, it will not be built, nor should it be." And then, only days after the State of the City address, 16 of the businesses to be displaced by this project went to court to try and get an injunction against it. While this effort would be unsuccessful, these merchants made it clear that they were prepared to file for injunction after injunction, tensions rising everywhere. But then, at the end of January, the City Council voted 4-1 to approve a tentative updated plan for the project, while still noting there were issues to be resolved. But in doing this, the city was put one step closer to investing that subsidy money that people were pissed about and condemning properties, which people were pissed about. Charles Jordan, much like before, was the one holdout vote. It was noted, at least within this update, that the Gilbert Building and the facade of the Goodenough Building would be saved. So it seemed the city and CF had managed to reach a compromise on this matter. And while her stance during the State of the City address had garnered much support for Mayor McCready, who was the frontrunner to be re-elected in the May 1980 election, By this point, City Council person Frank Ivancy had thrown his hat into the ring in the mayoral race. It was fixing to be a pretty chaotic spring in the City of Roses. You know, a season where, right in the middle of it, a guy blows up a public restroom just to make a point. But in this case, the businesses on site filed for another injunction in late February, another effort that would prove unsuccessful. But while those efforts weren't successful, something else that was gathering steam was an effort by a group called Save Our Livable Downtown, or SOLD, who petitioned successfully to try and get the city charter changed so that any efforts by a city to subsidize for a private development of more than one city block would have to go to the citizens for a vote. And while the CF project, in the works for over a year by the time May rolled around, was still closer than it had ever been to becoming a reality, there was still some uncertainty in the air. And then it happened. In the middle of that month, Dion Pacific, who was planning out a massive redevelopment project up in the Chinatown area, suddenly pulled out, blaming the decision on poor lending market conditions. Fears arose that CF may soon do the same, prompting the company's vice president to come out and say the project was still definitely a go. And then things went quiet for a little while, almost like some major event happened. Oh right, the mayoral election. On May 20th, 1980, this election took place, with Frank Ivancy merging as the winner over Connie McCready. But at least that's all that was happening. Fortunately, no other significant event was going on at this time. Oh yeah, Mount St. Helens would also blow its top on May 18th, only 2 days before the election. I mean, that'll certainly take the attention away from some little redevelopment project, too. But beyond these other events, another reason things had gone relatively quiet was in relation to a document called a Memorandum of Understanding. In short, this type of document, not legally binding, is just a formal document that outlines the general terms of an agreement between two or more parties. And while CF was supposed to sign this document on May 1st, they'd held out. And when this was rescheduled, they held out again. And then, the big announcement. It hit the headlines on June 6th, 1980. Cadillac Fairview had withdrawn their project. It had been more than 14 months since it was first introduced. And now it was over. And how'd that happen? Well, the main reason that Memorandum of Understanding could never get signed was simply due to the fact that CF and the PDC could not fully agree on the terms of the project, even after engaging in 16 different meetings with each other. And based on where they could not meet each other halfway, there are instances that are understandable and instances that aren't so much. Something understandable from CF's point of view was that they wanted very firm and specific commitments from the PDC in relation to things like finances and project design, whereas the PDC wanted their understanding to be more general. That would probably make me as a developer a little hesitant. But CF also wanted a commitment from the city that they would cover that subsidy money even if the urban renewal bonds that they were relying on couldn't be sold. Now, as a PDC person, that'd probably make me a little hesitant. CF was also concerned about the petition going around to make projects such as theirs subject to a vote by the people. With how long things had been delayed, if this was put on a November ballot and passed, it would likely just delay the project further and, with how a lot of locals felt about the project, odds are, if it went on the ballot, it would have been heavily defeated. And there goes your $100+ million project. There were just too many things that the two couldn't come to an agreement on, which might have been a smaller barrier to overcome had this been a brand new project, but it had been over a year. Incoming Mayor Ivancy said he wasn't surprised that things went the way they did, feeling that CF wanted too many commitments from the PDC that they felt would have put them into an untenable position with regards to any future negotiations. CF even wanted the city to be willing to purchase back the land that a hotel would have been on if they were unable to attract one to the area. The city was already selling them the property for under market value, investing millions, and CF was still expecting more. And I get it. The constant delays had probably scared any interested tenants away, but still, in one article it was written, in the end, what had appeared to be the developer's strength became its biggest weakness. Its inability to adapt and roll with the punches. Despite the failure of this project, it still had pushed forward the need to redevelop these blocks that had been sitting there fading over the years. So despite the CF project going south, the city was ready to go in terms of pursuing something new. And Cadillac Fairview scored a massive project down in Los Angeles the following month, so they were going to be fine. And there were still projects to happen in the near future, including the eventual Pioneer Courthouse Square, and in the fall of 1980, the Fountain Plaza project was established to redevelop a few downtown blocks, ultimately resulting in the construction of the Coin Tower, which opened in 1984. And in particular, the failure of the CF project allowed the 1893 Gilbert Building to survive, and come December 1980, only months after this failure, this building would be closed down, but with the plans to be renovated. And just a few months later, February 1981, the building would achieve landmark status in the city and ultimately be fixed up, and it still looks beautiful to this day. And in that same month, the city would put $12 million aside in the hopes of acquiring those 4 blocks that the CF was once chasing. The hopes still ran parallel to that previous project, with a hotel, office building, and several retail options planned. A scaled-down project was proposed in June 1981 to develop 3 of the 4 blocks, not including the block with the Gilbert Building on it. For a while, it was referred to as the Son of Cadillac Fairview project. Come 1982, the city finally began pursuing a developer for these blocks while they had already started purchasing a few properties on site, likely in the hopes of trying to avoid lots of property condemnation later on. The project would ultimately be set to have 240,000 square feet of retail space, along with a 400 to 500 room hotel and a 300,000 to 400,000 square foot office building. And hopes loomed large that the groundbreaking ceremony could happen come the summer of 1984. But if they thought it was all going to be easy from here, I mean, has anything been easy about redeveloping this space? While one previous project was unsuccessful, it is important to follow the process to understand how what ultimately ended up there. Thus, we have the story of how downtown Portland ended up with Pioneer Place. But early on, this would be better known as the Morrison Street Development Project, which, again, was also a side name for the Cadillac Fairview project. Ultimately, 3 developers would move ahead of the competition, with the Columbia, Maryland-based Rouse Company coming out on top and being selected to redevelop these blocks in June 1983. Their plan fit well with what was already considered a hotel, office building, department store, and even a parking garage for more than 1,000 cars. Early artist renderings of what the interiors would look like matched fairly close with the look that Pioneer Place would ultimately end up with. Scoring the posh Saks Fifth Avenue as a retailer on site all but wrapped up the project as a guarantee. So, of course, this is when problems started. As with the CF project, a major issue for people in town were planned sky bridges running between buildings. Fearing that sky bridges would create a tunnel-like effect on the streets below, the Rouse plan included a multi-story sky bridge. It was like asking for $10, getting rejected, and then asking for $50. The city and Rouse tried to compromise on the matter, but when all was said and done, only one sky bridge would be built. And that wouldn't happen until the end of the 90s, when the last phase of Pioneer Place was completed. The current bridge serves as a connector between the two blocks where the mall stands. And to try to meet people halfway, Rouse did plan on the sky bridges having glass walls so the sunlight could shine through, and the one sky bridge in existence is a glass one, and it doesn't really seem to bother anyone too much, so it pretty much worked out. A hope for a groundbreaking in the fall of 1985 would prove to be off by a couple of years. Come the start of 1986, they didn't even have a hotel chain lined up, and as you can see if you walk the area, ultimately, there would never be a hotel. The buildings, still standing on these blocks, had been vacated, and with the project being delayed, locals started noticing an increase in crime in the area with no business activity going on. Concerns grew so strong that this was another project that might not happen that the PDC started actively considering looking for another developer. Again, the Oregon Investment Council, previously making a massive investment into this project, would then withdraw $40 million of that investment. It wasn't looking great. But fortunately, no one gave up. Come October 1986, the PDC and the Rouse Company managed to reach an agreement on a new 4-block plan, which would include obtaining most of the block that the Gilbert building was located on to construct their parking garage, which would be completed there in 1989. Going into 1987, with the project back in motion, even the Investment Council made another investment, compensating for the $40 million they took back by putting in $110 million as a loan to cover the majority of the project's construction, which was projected to cost about $117 million. That would make this piece of work, like the CF project before then, the most expensive in the history of Portland. The project would ultimately be broken into 2 phases, with the northwesternmost block being the site for mall space, which would be described before then as a space for 80 to 90 shops and restaurants, and the block directly south of that, the planned site for the office building. March 3rd, 1988, and finally a groundbreaking ceremony. A real project, a real change was finally going to happen. This would be followed by the demolition of the buildings on site, excluding the Gilbert building, of course. And despite the push to at least save the facade of the good enough building, it would be demolished for this project with little resistance or even interest. Getting far more attention was the larger Corbett building, which would be imploded before a massive crowd lined with cameras on May 1st, 1988. The construction of Pioneer Place was a major eye-catcher as the work took off in almost 4 completely empty blocks in the middle of downtown. I even vaguely remember it as I took lots of trips on the Max Blue Line, which travels down Morrison Street as a kid when my mom worked downtown. The office building would open on February 7th, 1990, with the Retail Pavilion, as it was originally called, aka the mall portion, opening on March 29th that same year. It wouldn't be until 1998 that Phase 2, which was the northeasternmost block, would start. This was another mall block, matching closely with the one that opened in 1990. This block would be completed and open on March 29th, 2000, exactly a decade after the other building opened, and just a little over 20 years after it all technically began. And since these blocks have remained the same, with the two mall blocks connected by a sky bridge, the office building, the parking garage, and, of course, the Gilbert building clinging to it all. Yeah, so I mean, when I click on info from this building, it just kind of references it as the backside of the Old Taylor Hotel, but that's obviously not what it actually is. But this is obviously an older building, pre-1979. Mostly looks vacant. I'm assuming it's vacant. And then you have the, refurbished back then, Taylor Hotel. One of the key buildings that they were really trying to save. And they were even contemplating moving it across the street where this other hotel is today. At the time, there was just an older store building that was actually built like in the late 1800s. It was a pretty old building. So they were probably just gonna, but there wasn't really much to it. It wasn't of any great historical significance other than just being old. So they were probably gonna just tear that down, and they were actually gonna try to move this whole building right over there. At least that was the general plan. I don't know, maybe that would have happened had the project not fallen through. And then right here, this is 3rd and Taylor, so we're at the southeastern corner. You've got some beautiful old town structures down here. You've got a little bit over here, the empty space where the Lotus used to be, and down here was a lot of where the old, the other Skid Row was located. It's more kind of just down, like right down here, like just south of where the project would have been. And so, as I mention or will mention, this has always been kind of a transitional area, historically speaking. There was always, whatever was going on further that way, it was always a little bit different than what was going on down this way, be it commercial or residential or, what have you. People like to romanticize the 80s, which is fine. I do it too, and I barely remember any of it. But this tends to deceive an outsider in terms of the complete reality of this period of time. Sure, the 80s were fun, things were more affordable, the music was better, but it was also a time in Portland where we saw a drug epidemic get out of control. And it was also a time where the downtown area struggled in terms of its retail core. These problems, again, stretched back into the 70s, and through the failure of the Cadillac Fairview project, along with the hardly problem-free Pioneer Place project, we saw those struggles. There were lots of concerns throughout the 80s as to the stability of downtown, and thus when Pioneer Place opened, it was met with great fanfare, and perhaps with at least a little relief. Through these projects, in particular the CF one, we also see a city that rose up and fought relentlessly against something that they felt posed so many red flags. And it's easy to look back now and say the people of the city screwed themselves out of a successful complex, but that's the thing about democracy, or at least how it's supposed to function. When the vast majority of a city's citizens don't want something, with few exceptions, that should be that. And if it's a bunch of clowns making a stressful economic situation worse, that's their decision. If they're trying to salvage a disappearing cultural element of a city, along with some historic buildings, while stopping what appeared to be a monolithic project pushed into its first stages without any citizen involvement in the first place, then that's their decision. Again, these people weren't fighting the revitalization of their retail core. They were just fighting this particular version of it. And people are going to reflect on it in their own ways, often, unfortunately, with their own biases. Some businessmen and real estate developers may see what happened here as a tragic failure, a city shooting itself in the foot. Historians, at least some, and proud locals might see it another way. Something that failed, but something else came along in the process. Arguing over what would have been better, the project we never got or the one we did, is an argument that's going to just turn us round and round, with no one ever knowing for absolute certainty how an alternative history might have gone. Nonetheless, it is a fascinating part of the Rose City's history, and a key event that was in progress as the city transitioned from one decade into the next. An uncertain project in a downtown with an uncertain future.